There we go.
All right, good evening, everybody. Good to see you all. It is Monday, January the 25th. You're right, 25th. And last Monday of January we'll meet. Next time we'll meet is February 1st. I don't know if that's special at all. It just is what it is. Let's see. Make sure you have yourself a Bible. Make sure you have your worksheet, or your workbook rather, and open up to lesson number 14. Number 14. We are one lesson away from being halfway through. Okay. 30 lessons in the year, and we're just about halfway there. For those of you gathering with us online, welcome to you as well, and let's jump in. So last week we talked about Saul and then David, one of the more well-known stories of David and Goliath and so forth. Who can tell me why Saul became king of the Israelites? Why? Not how, but why. Why did Saul become king? Ada?
Because everyone wanted a king.
There you go, right? And we kind of poked fun at him a little bit to say that they wanted a king. Now, how did God prefer to do it? How did he want to rule people, Andrew?
He told the priests and prophets what he wanted, and then they do what he wanted.
There you go. All right. So there was more of a direct line, and in fact, when they came to, prophets and Moses and things like that, and complained about where they were walking and so forth, it wasn't at the time of Moses, but as they complained about leadership, one of the things when God spoke through Samuel was that tell the people this: if you get a king, he's going to demand things from you, right? Your sons are going to become his soldiers. Your daughters are going to become bakers and servants, and he's going to have some of your land, and he's going to take some of your horses and camels and things like that, because you have to essentially employ a king. You don't hire him, but he doesn't work for free, and he doesn't lead for nothing, and you have to have a castle, and you got to protect him, and all these kind of things. So he says, you don't want a king. And they kept saying, no, we want a king. Everybody else has got a king. And so we want one. And so Saul becomes the first king. After a little while, he was relatively successful. Do you guys remember what happened that made him no longer a king? Not his death. That would be kind of obvious. Landry?
So he was tired of waiting for Eli to make the offerings, so he went and made the offerings himself. But then Eli showed up at that moment and told him, no, you're not supposed to do that.
So, yeah, he gets this idea in his head that he needs the blessing of God. He doesn't want to wait for God. He wants to be patient for God or God's messenger. And so he went and did it himself. And I think we used the example last week of Jace preaching a sermon for me and saying if pastor's not going to do it, he'll just jump up there and do it. I don't think that would be a terrible thing like it was for Saul. But the point is that it was just impatience. And then so Samuel gets the word from God, we're going to have another king. Right? Saul has kind of fallen out of grace, as it were, in the eyes of God, and it's time to get a new king. And so he goes to Jesse and looks at his sons and starts kind of, he didn't really do this, but I know sometimes you guys ever do this in a game where you're voting for something in school or maybe on a team, and somebody puts their hand over there, like, everybody cheer, right? And whoever cheers the loudest, right, that's who wins. I imagine in some way that's kind of what Samuel was waiting for. Stands in front of Jesse's oldest son and going, all right, Lord, is this the next king? He's the oldest, most mature, he's the tallest, and so forth. They're like, nope, move on. Goes to the next son and the next son and the next son. Pretty soon he's out of sons. And he's like, Lord, I'm here at this family. This is where you sent me. And so he asks Jesse, do you have any other sons? And he goes, well, we got the one runt that's tending sheep out in the field. That's David. But he's like, he's like 14, 15 years old. And Samuel goes, God said it's going to be one of your boys, so bring him in. Brings him in. God tells him, he said, this is going to be the king. Right? And so that's when it kind of starts to unfold. And then we see some of the habits of David. Does anybody remember the phrase that God applies to David? He says that David is what? How does he identify him? Do you guys remember, David?
He was a man after God's own heart.
So this phrase is kind of an interesting phrase. To be a man, or a woman for that matter, after God's own heart it was a unique relationship, or a unique way to identify with God. Now, can you guys tell me, we're going to look at it tonight, but I imagine some of you know the backstory of David. Can you tell me something bad that David did in his life? Something bad that King David did. David and Goliath is kind of a great story. Landry?
When he saw Bathsheba, he killed her husband and took her as his wife instead of just letting her be.
Yeah, he kind of did a bunch of things wrong there, right? He's up on his palace, and we'll talk about it tonight. But he does this terrible thing: commits adultery, commits murder. I mean, by his order, he didn't do it with his own hand, but he called for it. Lies about it, covers it up, and so forth. And then eventually, one of the prophets, a guy by the name of Nathan, comes and exposes David and says, "God told me to tell you this." Right? He comes and kind of expresses with it, God knows what you've done. And so David repents. He feels terrible. And he cries out to God, "Please forgive me." And God forgives him. That's what God's grace is, right? No matter how bad we mess up and how bad we sin, God says, "My grace is bigger than your sin." And so that points us more to what this means, that says that David was a man after God's own heart. It doesn't mean that he was a good man all the time. In fact, in many times, David was a scoundrel. He wasn't a great king all the time, and yet he was still referred to as a man after God's own heart. In fact, even Jesus, as the Messiah, is sometimes referred to as the son of David, because it came from his line, right? So David is, in fact, Jews today, if someone is an Orthodox Jew, that means a traditional Bible-believing Jew, right? How are Jews different than Christians? Landry?
They don't believe in the New Testament.
They don't believe in the New Testament. And who's pretty key in the New Testament? Jesus, always the right answer in confirmation, right? So they don't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. So they're still waiting for the Messiah. Now their idea, right, I'm going to speak for most Jews here, their idea of who the Messiah is going to be as a Savior, they believe it's going to be somebody very much like David. They think it's going to be a king, that he is going to take and rule the promised land, and he's going to create peace in the Middle East by force. And the Jews are going to rule, kind of like the Hebrews believed that they were the chosen people from long ago. And so they're really waiting. The bad news is, when the Savior does come, it's his second time. Right? They're waiting for the first time. This is going to be his second time, and it's too late at that point. Okay, so we go from Saul to David, and now tonight we go David to his son, Solomon. Right? Now, without reading too much into this, you guys probably know some of this. What do we know about Solomon? Landry?
He built the first temple.
He built the first temple, and it is extraordinary. We're actually going to look at it tonight briefly. What else do we know about Solomon? What else? Anything else about Solomon? There's something that he stands out from any person ever. Ada?
He was the wisest person ever.
He was the wisest person ever. Now you could say, well, that was a long time ago. God actually says you are going to be the wisest of every man that has ever lived, every man that ever will live. Landry?
He also had more than 100 wives.
He had 1,000, right? He had 700 wives and 300, I'll call them girlfriends, right? It was, holy cow, right? 1,000 partners, right? 1,000, not all wives, 700 were wives. Now, back then, by the way, that was not something that God endorsed. He didn't honor that. God said in the very beginning, Adam, here's your wife, right? This is Eve. That's it. That's the way I made you. One man, one woman. That's marriage in God's eyes. But Solomon really took a run at it this way. Politically speaking, it was a way to bring peace between two nations or two countries. Okay? Now that seems weird, but if you guys go back to the Middle Ages here in like Europe and things like that, a lot of times you guys have read stories, you know, they're kind of fantasy sometimes, where a king's daughter marries the son of another king, and that brings the two kingdoms together. That's what Solomon did over and over and over again. But it wasn't his son getting married, it was him. Right? So he had 700 politically arranged marriages to some degree. We're going to see some of those. And then 300 300 other women, right? I mean, it's not moral at all, okay? And I can't imagine how he could spend quality time with all of them. I mean, I would think that you'd be a wife of Solomon and go, yeah, we haven't talked for like 8 months. You know, because there's 700 of them. And not to mention, where do you house 700 wives? I mean, if you had a hotel, right? I just can't imagine. It's just a bizarre thought for me. Anyhow, so look at page 57. Everybody go there. Fill these in. How would you define the word wisdom? Everybody take a run at it right now. Define wisdom. Under that first line, just write something down. You home to it, do it as well. How would you define the word wisdom? Please don't just put one word. It's more than that. How would you define wisdom? I'll give you just a minute or so, and then we'll just kind of start chiming in and see what you guys think. How would you define the word wisdom? Kind of expand on it, whatever you wrote down. Right? To kind of give you some guidance here. Is it different than being smart? Yeah, I would agree. I would agree. It's not the same. Is it related? Yeah, I think it's in the same ballpark, but it's not the same. If you were intelligent, if you were smart, I think wisdom is a little bit different. All right? Jace, what do you have? Okay, so you think a little bit more. I think that's a good place to start. I think smart is right, but I think there's more to it. If I were smart, that might mean that I just have knowledge, right? If you're like, do you know the square root of 16? If you do, you're smart. Now, if I know the square root of 16, doesn't necessarily make me wise. Okay, so think of that a little bit. And Joe?
Knowing the right thing.
Knowing the right thing. See, now you're applying smart. Right? Knowing the right thing is a little bit different. Saying that, for instance, if Landry came in and had a haircut, right? Had a new haircut, and it looked different. Okay? Knowing the right thing would be to say what, Anna Jo?
It looks great.
Exactly. That is the right thing. That's wisdom. Smart might just be, hey, your hair got cut. And Landry would be like, well, what do you think about it? The right thing, knowing the right thing would be like, it looks beautiful. You look different. It's just everything about it. Landry, what do you think? What's wisdom?
Knowledge of things in the world and right and wrong.
Oh, yeah, there you go. All right, knowledge of things in the world, right? Where you live, you've experienced things, you've seen things. Mason, wisdom?
Having the right ideas.
Right ideas, right? So how you think, not just putting ideas out there. Leah?
Common sense.
Common sense, I like that one. Yeah. Common sense today, not all that common. Yeah, in a way. Ada?
You have knowledge and you know how to use it, or you have discretion.
You know how to use it, or discretion, which means you're going to judge whether or not to act a certain way. Very good. Micah?
Knowledge, knowing when to apply that.
Knowing when to apply it. I like that. Connor, anything different?
Same thing like Micah said, knowledge and stuff.
Okay, very good. All right, so I want you to think of who is one person in your life that you would consider wise, and I want you to jot down some details about this person in the space below, right? So you don't have to write their name. You know who it is. It's your book. But I want you to think of someone who's wise, and then I want you to write down some characteristics of why they're wise in your mind. Just real quick. Jot down why you think they're wise, or what makes them wise. It has less to do with what you guys have described. So if it's a parent, if it's a teacher, if it's a neighbor, if it's a coach, grandparent, and you're like, well, I think they're wise. Well, why does it make them wise? They teach me good things. They share good stories. They're often right. They don't get in trouble by, doing things too often, stuff like that. We might go, hey, that's wise. Okay? How they act helps people, right? They keep me safe. That probably has to do with wisdom, right? If you have an adult around you when you were a little toddler and you're running with a knife, wisdom would say, hey, don't run with a knife. Now, don't have a knife at all if you're a toddler, right? But I mean, that would be wisdom, right? If just because they know things, they might go, hey, nice cut. That's knowledge. Doesn't really help you much if it's a toddler you're walking around with one, right? Wisdom would say, don't do that. Stop from doing that. That's the difference. Okay, let's keep going. So, in today's big picture, down there in that brown box, do I have a volunteer to read that? Anna Jo, please.
After David becomes king, he establishes his kingdom in Jerusalem. There, David desires to build a temple to the Lord, but God tells him that David's descendant would build him a temple, and David's throne would last forever. David continues to rule as king, and though he has a heart for the Lord, he is far from perfect. David commits adultery and has a friend killed to cover up his sin. God confronts David, and David repents and is forgiven. David's troubles continue as one of his sons tries to overthrow him, and nearly does, and David must fight a war against him. After David dies, his throne goes to his son Solomon, to books of wisdom that
Nope, go up one more line, stupid line. To whom God grants.
wealth and wisdom to rule. Solomon builds a temple to the Lord and writes 3 books of wisdom that are found in the Bible. As Solomon's power increases, however, he marries many foreign women who bring their idols and false worship in Israel. Sadly, near the end of his reign, Solomon worships many false gods. God cannot let these horrific sins pass, and so, after Solomon's reign, life for God's people will be different in Israel.
Very good, thank you. So at the very bottom of the page, you guys see the timeline there. We've got Abraham in 2000 BC, Moses at 1500, David at about 1000 BC. So we're 1,000 years from Jesus at this point, right? So we just keep kind of clicking it along. So let's take a look at some more of the details, all right? Turn to page 58. Now, what you're going to see on these 2 pages, again, is a big long arrow, right? If this were a geometry class, that would be a ray, right? A line that goes in one direction. Here's what I'd like you to do on those little dots. We did this last week, but what I want you to do is recognize it's a continuation from last week. So the first dot on this line, put 11. Because last week we had 10, 1 through 10. So just so we get the idea that it continues, do 11, 12, it should go all the way to 17. So number the dots, right? 11, 12, 13, 14 on one page, 15, 16, 17 on the next page. That keeps us in mind that we've got something going on for us that shows us that it continues as the timeline continues. In your Bibles, please, 2 Samuel 7. 2 Samuel 7. When somebody has a page number, shout it out. 2 Samuel 7, we're going to start with verse 4.
305.
305, there you go. Right? Open it up. I hope you all have the same Bible. I know there's a couple different ones out there, but try 305 first.
The different one is 259.
259, all right. All right.
The large print is.
Yeah, I know that throws off the numbering a little bit. All right, so we have, after David finally got a break from his wars, I'm reading under David wants a temple, and settled down in his new capital city of Jerusalem. So I want you guys to understand that Jerusalem used to be a pagan city, right? It sits up on a high plateau on a hill, okay? So it's really a good place to have a capital city. It's easier to defend, right? It's easier to defend a hill than it is someplace that's flat where everybody can come at it from every direction. There's only 1 or 2 ways you can really get at it. Otherwise, you have to scale, a really steep mountain to get up to it. And so it's a good place to be. So he makes his capital city there. Now, so Jerusalem, we often imagine that Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, there's buildings, there's the temple, all those things. There's no temple here. So up until this point, you guys tell me, where did we worship God? Right?
Tabernacle.
The tabernacle. So if you guys remember Samuel, right, serving in the tabernacle with Eli, I preached on it a couple weeks ago. You've got Moses and the children of Israel wandering through the wilderness, setting up the tabernacle every once in a while to worship God. God would appear as a column of fire at night, a column of smoke in the daytime, and that was kind of God's presence. So this mobile church is really what they've been using so far. Imagine kind of a circus tent. I don't know if you've been to a circus, but the great big tents. This isn't a go camping with your family tent. This thing's, probably 2 or 3 times the size of this room, right? Stretches that long, a little bit wider, and so forth. And that would be the tabernacle, okay? In fact, if this were the tabernacle here in the fellowship hall, if you imagine that wall separating us and the kitchen were a curtain, right? In the kitchen, that would be what we'd call the Holy of Holies. And in the kitchen is where the Ark of the Covenant would be. You guys remember that box that carried some really important things? The Ten Commandments, manna, and so forth. And you don't go back behind that curtain but once a year to offer a sacrifice for the sins of the people, right? So that curtain stays covered. Later on, when Solomon constructs a temple, those spaces still exist. There's a Holy of Holies, there's the holy place, there's the courtyard, and so forth. All right. So 2 Samuel 7, 4 through 17. I want everybody to read 2 verses for me. I'm going to start over here with Jace. Start with verse 4 from chapter 7, and it should start out, but that same night. Everybody read 2 verses as we go around the room.
But that same night the word of the Lord came to Nathan, Go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, would you build me a house to dwell in?
Yep, just 2.
I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I have been moving about in my tent for my dwelling. In all places where I have moved with all the people of Israel, did I speak a word with any of the judges of Israel, whom I have commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, Why have you not built me a house of cedar?
Now therefore thus you shall say to my servant David, Thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture from the following sheep, that you may be prince over my people. And I have been with you wherever you went, and have cut off your enemies from you before. And I will make you a great name, and the name of the great ones of earth.
And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, so that they may dwell in their own place, and be disturbed no more. And violent men shall afflict them no more, as formerly, from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel. And I will give you rest from all your enemies, whenever the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. When the days are fulfilled, and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come up from your body, and I will establish his kingdom.
He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish. Whoops.
That's right. Go ahead, Leah. Read 13 for me.
He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever.
All right, Leah.
I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you.
And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words, and in accordance with all this vision, Nathan spoke to David.
All right, so what he's basically saying is God is saying, would you build me a house to dwell in? God is not asking David to do it. He's asking him and said, would you really build a house that you're going to contain me? I've walked with you in the wilderness with all my people. I've been there. I've been present. I don't need a house, right? So David wants a house because he thinks it's the right thing to do. We need to have a place where we can focus on God, we can gather together, and I'm kind of a great king. I can do this, right? That we're profitable, we're blessed and fruitful as a people. We should build a large building for you. You guys can understand here in January how hard it would be to be church if we had to meet in a tent, right? Instead of having faith as a building, what if we just had a tent? And he's like, we need a building, right? We need to build something sturdy, something that'll last, and so forth. So David was really thinking much the same way. So, how is God's word here about David's son, and how is it also about Jesus? So, in verse 12, it says, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, that means you die, right? When you lie down with your fathers, right, your past generations, they die. And he says, when you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, your son, right? After you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. Okay? So, what does that seem to say about David's son? What's God saying about his son? Take a look at that verse again, 12. What's he saying? What's going to happen with his son? What's he going to do?
He'll make him into the king.
Yeah, so he's going to rule as well. That's good news, right? It doesn't mean that somebody else is going to take over. It doesn't mean that your kingdom's going to crumble. It means that your kingdom, you're going to pass it on to your offspring, and he's going to be king. So jot that down, right? So David's son will rule as well. And if you want to, just write in the word Solomon so you know that that's who we're talking about there. How is this also about Jesus? Look at verse 13. And he shall build a house for my name. He's talking about Solomon, going to build a temple. And I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Forever seems like a long time, right? Have you ever seen a president that was president forever? Nope. A king, anywhere in human history, it's been a king forever. Okay? So who's he talking about? Jesus. It's the right answer in confirmation all the time, right? So from the line of David, now they don't know this. God didn't say, by the way, the Messiah is going to come from your offspring eventually, 1,000 years down the road. But here he actually is saying that. He said, your kingdom is going to be established forever, right? And so he's given them that insight. So jot that down, right? The fact is that the kingdom is going to be forever, and that refers to Jesus, right? That eternity ongoing, okay? Okay, so then comes David's terrible sin. Sometime later, then we're looking at number 12 if you numbered those. David committed a terrible sin. He committed adultery with the wife of one of his faithful soldiers. She became pregnant, and though David tried to cover it up, he ended up having her husband, Uriah, killed in battle. God sent the prophet Nathan, and we just heard from Nathan in the beginning of this reading here, to confront David about his sin, and though he would have to suffer loss. You guys heard in the previous one where it says that as the king, David's own son, Absalom, all right, rises up and wants to overthrow him and so forth. That's part of the penalty of David's sin. See, what we sometimes forget is that David was forgiven, right, for his sin of adultery and murder, but it was not consequence-free. Okay? So, for instance, if you've ever gotten in trouble at home, right, and mom or dad kind of go, well, here's the consequence, you're going to lose this, you're going to get this, whatever, but there's a punishment, but they don't necessarily kick you out and write you off forever, right? They're kind of like, you lied to me, you're going to lose this, but I still love you, right? So it's like you're a woman or a man or a boy or a girl after mom and dad's own heart, but there's still consequences for your sin. So David still has consequences, right? Just because you're forgiven doesn't mean they are consequence-free actions, all right? David repented and was forgiven, and then he wrote Psalm 51. Everybody turn to Psalm 51 for a minute. Psalm 51. Just a little bit past where you are, about 8 books. Psalm 51. David wrote most of the Psalms. There's a handful in there that he did not. All right, there are, 19 verses. Let's have everybody try to read 2 of them, and then I'll finish up the rest. So, Connor, I'm going to start with you. In fact, we'll just go backwards, right? Connor, Micah, and then Ada, and so forth.
Have mercy on me, O God, according to the steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy. Blot out means erase them. Blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin.
Well done.
For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you, you only, have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words, and blameless in your judgment.
Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Behold, you delight in truth in the inward being, and you teach me wisdom in the secret heart.
Purge me with
Hyssop.
and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have broken rejoice.
Hide your face from sins and blot out all my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me.
Deliver me from blood guiltiness, O God of my salvation, and my tongue will sing aloud of your righteousness.
O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise. For you will not delight in sacrifice, or I will give it. You will not be pleased with the burnt offering.
The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. Do good design in your good pleasure. Build up the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in right sacrifices, in burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings. Then bulls will be offered on your altar. So as David writes this psalm, it's a song. I know their songs are not the same as our songs. Our songs are poetic. The last word rhymes many times in songs that we sing. That's just kind of how we're wired. But these were songs that they would sing and chant and so forth. But they were often an explanation or an expression of what they were feeling, what they were dealing with. This is David after Nathan had come to him and said, you have sinned. God knows that you not only committed adultery, that you fathered a child now that's another man's wife, and you've killed him in battle, and you lied to people about it, and now you're trying to cover it up. And so it just snowballed, one lie after another after another. And eventually Nathan confronts him, and he says, I've messed up. I'm sorry. And he repents to God, and God says, well, you're forgiven. And as he is forgiven, this is his response to Psalm 51. So I want you to think of some of the things that stick out to you, maybe that we learn about David, about this prayer. And I want to just give you some guidance on that, maybe jot some down, because we're going to be using these in the future. Maybe put some bullet points under there in that gap. The first one is what he talks about, I know my transgressions, my sin is ever before me. What he's talking about is my heart is more important than words. Right? So jot that down. My heart is more important than words. Okay? He said, you have done what is evil in your sight. If I just said I'm sorry, but I don't change how I feel or believe or so forth, then it's just words. Second little bullet point I want you to highlight here is this. Be honest and transparent, because God already knows. Be honest and transparent, because God already knows.
What was the first one?
The first one is the heart is more important than words. Second one is be honest and transparent, because God already knows. So David confesses his sin, saying, you know what I've done. Right? I don't have to tell you. Now, it doesn't mean I'm kind of haphazard about it, but he says, God knows. That's why he confesses. Everybody got those two? All right, one more. Trust God's promise of forgiveness. Trust God's promise of forgiveness. Those are the things, the main messages we get out of Psalm 51. All right? All right. So let's go up to 2 Samuel again, close to where we were. 2 Samuel 18. Okay, go back to where you were. So 300s, I think, or the 290s if Ada's Bible, I think, somewhere in there. 260s. 2 Samuel 18, verse 33, David's trouble continues when one of his sons, named Absalom, rose up and tried to overthrow his father and take the throne. God told him this would be a punishment. He says there's not going to be peace in your family. All right? And so, since we were talking about hair already tonight, right, with poor Landry, okay, what are you doing? Absalom has this great big old head of hair, right? And the reason we know that is as he rises up against his dad and forms an army, he's trying to overthrow dad, and it's just a lot of conflict, and there's battles and so forth. David, his generals are like going, listen, let's just kill him, right? And David's like, but it's my son. It's amazing how forgiving David is. And I think the reason David is so forgiving is because he's been forgiven. Right? God's forgiven him this incredible sin, a bunch of sins. And so he's like, I just want my son back. And yet his son's like, I want the throne, I want to be king. And David's like, but I was anointed by God. I can't just give it up. I don't just hand it over to somebody. God put me in this role. I got to do this. Right? So one day while his generals are out scouting and things like that, Absalom is riding his donkey instead of a horse, I guess. And he rides underneath a tree. And his hair gets caught in the branches of the tree. Okay? Kind of an interesting story. And the donkey keeps going. Okay? So there he is, hanging by his hair. Okay? They're kind of swinging in the branches and so forth. And one of the generals sees him. And they're like, that's the guy. That's the enemy of our trouble right now. And he's just a giant human piñata right now. Okay? And so time to walk over there with a big stick. Okay? And it's actually worse than that. And they go over there with several javelins, and they all gather around him, and the long story short is they kill him. Right? And when they report this back to David, he's devastated because he loves his son. Right? Even though his son had tried to kill him, he did a couple of times, went up battle against him, and so forth. Would somebody read 2 Samuel 18, verse 33 for me, please? Nice and loud. This is after he heard the news. Somebody have it? Go ahead, Landry. And the king was.
And the king was deeply moved and went up into the chamber and over the gate and wept. As he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, why I had died instead of you, Absalom, my son, my son."
All right. Would I have died instead of you? He's like, I wish I were dead instead of you. I mean, that's how distraught he was. And so his general was like going, I'm just doing you a favor. I mean, he's kind of public enemy number one. We got to get rid of him. You know, that's what you do in battle. And David's like, but I don't want my son to die. And what a strange way to die, right? To just be hanging in a tree and having some of David's royal guards and things like that take him out. So after David dies, we're looking down here underneath that, Solomon becomes king. So before David died, he gave instructions to Solomon before Solomon became king of Israel. Now, Solomon isn't necessarily the same in anointing from Samuel at this point. Samuel's not with us anymore. But because lineage is the way it works, if you are a son, you take over for dad. That's just kind of the way it was. If there weren't sons, daughter would take over, be queen. Right? That's kind of how we had kings and queens in past history anyhow. Right? So go to now 1 Kings. Right? 1 Kings chapter 2. 1 Kings chapter 2, begin with the first verse. Right? Let me just read this for us. When David's time drew near, he commanded Solomon his son, saying, I am about to go the way of all the earth. Notice what he's talking about, because everything dies. Right? Be strong and show yourself a man. Keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways, and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses. So what's he telling him to follow? What's he saying? He's saying, Solomon, what should you follow as a king?
The 10 Commandments.
The 10 Commandments. Follow the Bible. Right? God's given us his word. Follow it. Make this the most important thing. He said that the Lord may establish his word that he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons pay close attention to their way to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. God had said to David, if your sons follow me, they'll be blessed. Right? Now, do you think that the opposite is also true? Yeah, if they reject God, there's consequences for that. He actually makes the same promise to us. If you follow my commandments, there'll be blessings that will come. Doesn't necessarily mean life's going to be easy. Just means there's blessings. Okay? But there's also consequences when we reject God's direction. Right? So, in your own words, I want you to summarize what David told Solomon to do as a king. So jot something down there. In your own words, what did David tell Solomon to do as king? Just jot it down in your own words. At times, if you have ever looked through, and we will in the future, look through the catechism, many times when Martin Luther gave what he expressed as an explanation for a commandment, right? Here's the commandment, then we say, what does this mean? And it has that. It often has that part of the explanation as we are to fear, love, and trust God, right? Those three words. actually comes from that guidance that David is giving to Solomon. Right? I want you to fear and revere God. I want you to trust him, and I want you to love him above all things. And so that same cause, or that same call, is given from us as well. At the bottom of the page 58, Solomon's books in the Bible. He wrote 3 different books. Solomon offered 3 books of wisdom in the Bible. Keeping your finger here, I want you to turn back to page 14. Page 14 in your workbook. Go back to page 14. Leaving your finger there. You don't lose your spot. Go back to page 14. And what you will find is a list of books of the Bible. If you remember, we went through that. Do you find the books of wisdom? Right? You see them there? Okay, how many total are there? They're in 2 different places. A couple different places, actually. How many are there? You guys see them? See them? There's 5. Okay? So, Solomon wrote 3 of them. Can you pick out which 3 altogether there? You guys see them? All 3: Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, not necessarily in that order. The other 2 are
Psalms and Job.
Psalms, and who wrote most of the Psalms? David, most of them. And who wrote Job? Job, or somebody that was really close to Job that wrote it down for him. So that's those 3. Now go back to page 58. Just wanted to get clear on what that is. Now each of the books has a very specific message, right? Ecclesiastes, if you look at that kind of tan scroll there, Ecclesiastes, life without God is empty. The only rescue comes from God as he leads us to fear, love, and trust him and his word. Notice those words again. Fear, love, and trust. There it is. Okay? Proverbs, this book describes God's wisdom by contrasting the actions of wise and foolish people. And when you read through the Proverbs, there are statements of, here's what it means to be wise. And then it also tells you, here's what it means to be foolish. Okay? I would imagine that there have been times as you have been taught by wise people, parents, grandparents, teachers, whatever. They have pointed out things that you have done or said that were foolish, and things that you have done and said that were wise. Right? Hoping to teach more wise things so that you develop wisdom rather than foolishness. Okay? We should learn from our foolishness. Okay? Song of Solomon, that's kind of an unusual one. Though married love is wonderful, God's love for you in Christ is the greatest love of all. So the Song of Solomon is a very interesting subject matter about the love between a man and a woman. And it seems strange as far as a book within all of the collection of the 66 books of the Bible. But throughout the Bible, at least in the New Testament specifically, it does say it in the Old Testament as well, God often relates to us as people as he is the groom and his church is what? If God is the groom, the church is the bride. Okay, so there's that relationship of love. Okay, so so we don't think it's like, so we're all the bride. Yeah, well, don't overthink it like we're all female or wearing a white dress. It's just talking about this relationship between man and woman is how God created the first 2 humans, Adam and Eve. He said, you're built for this relationship. And God said, because I gave you a soul, because I gave you my image, we are built for that relationship as well. This perfect love relationship. So even though the Song of Solomon seems to dive into the love relationship between a man and a woman, communicated by Solomon, who had 700 wives, 300 girlfriends, and so forth. It's a relationship ultimately not about Solomon and his wives. It's a relationship really ultimately reflecting God and us. And that's how we keep it into perspective. Okay? All right? All right, turn it over, page 59. Let's keep chugging along. So God comes to Solomon. This is one of the great stories of Solomon. This is one of the real pieces of good news for Solomon. Once Solomon became king, all right, he's young, all right, he's not a grown man. David dies, and Solomon just kind of takes over. That's what happens as it's passed on. God came to him in a vision. And what did Solomon ask for? Why do you think this is so pleasing to God? So let's climb in here and let's do this. Read 2 verses again. I'll start with Jace over here. Start with verse 3 of 1 Kings 3. Everybody there? 1 Kings 3, starting with verse 3. Let's read 2 verses at a pop. Go ahead, Jace.
Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. Only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. And the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar.
At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask what I shall give you." And Solomon said, "You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart towards you. And you have kept him for this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne this day."
And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in the place of my father David. Although I am a little child, I do not know how to go or come in. And your servant is the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered, or multitude to count.
Give your servant therefore an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to govern this your great people?
Stop right there, Mason. So that's the request. Right? There's what it is. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people. What does that sound like? An understanding mind to govern. Wisdom. Bingo. Read the next verse for me, Mason. Keep going.
It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this.
Go ahead, Leah.
And God said to him, "Because you have asked this, and not asked for yourself long life or riches of the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right. Behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall arise before you."
I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you, not all your days. And if you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days.
Go ahead, Micah. One more.
And Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Then he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and offered up burnt offerings and peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants.
All right, so what did Solomon ask for then? Wisdom. God said, write that down. Write that down. He asked for wisdom. God said you didn't ask for wealth or power or long life or for your enemies to die. You could have asked for those. And I don't mean to belittle this, guys. I certainly don't when I think about what God said. But it's almost as if God came to him in the dream and said, "I'll give you one wish." Now, wish is not the right word, but that's kind of what we understand. If somebody said, "I'm going to give you one wish and you can ask for anything," that's really what God was saying to Solomon. Solomon, what do you want? Right? I've been pleased with how you've been a king as you get started. What do you want? And Solomon says, "I want to be wise." For what purpose? Why do you think he wanted to be wise as a king? Who's he thinking about?
So he could make the right decisions for the kingdom?
Yeah, he's thinking of the people, right? He's not thinking of him. He's like, I want to be immortal. I want to be rich. I want to be powerful. All those things are focused on yourself. He says, I want to be wise so that I can take care of your people, God. I want to be good at being a king, okay? And so that's your answer to that. Why was God pleased in that? Because Solomon was considering others instead of himself. So jot that down. Solomon was considering others instead of himself. All right, so then Solomon builds the temple. This is when it was first built. By the way, this is the first of 2 temples, right? Because there's going to be another temple that a guy by the name of Herod is going to build. And actually, Herod's temple was a gift to the Jewish people to keep them calm. When they had captured the Jews, right? See, now Solomon is king over the Holy Land, right? Over the Promised Land. Later on, the Romans come sweeping in. They're in charge. But to kind of keep the Jews, we'd say, pacified, which means kind of happy, he says, I'll build a temple for you. And he actually builds a temple. Solomon built it. I believe it took several hundred years to actually construct before it was done. You see the picture of it down the bottom, page 59. So Solomon, not David. Remember, David wanted to build God a temple, and God goes, I don't need a temple. Okay? He says, your son will take care of that. He moved the Ark of the Covenant into the Most High Place. That's the kitchen. If we're standing in the temple here, right? That's the kitchen. Imagine we didn't have a ceiling here. And by the way, all the pews are right above us, if you knew that, where we are. And if you could look all the way up to the ceiling, that would be very similar to what the temple would be like. It's about 45 feet in the temple, from the floor to the top of the ceiling. Pretty high building for back then, for engineering. And all the way across and so forth. So, it says, look at the artist's rendering below. By the way, we don't know exactly what the temple looked like, because nobody painted it, nobody drew it, and we don't have measurements for it. We just find bits and pieces and kind of the general layout, but when it was destroyed by Rome in 70 AD, they destroyed it. I mean, they wrecked it. They didn't just knock it over and leave it in rubble. I mean, they leveled the place. And the Holy Land, because this is 2,000 years ago, has been built upon and built upon and built upon. So stuff goes down, they build up again and add to it, and so forth. So when Solomon dedicated the temple, this is the second paragraph there, something incredible happened. In 1 Kings 8, 10, and 11, you don't have to read it right now, but a cloud of God's presence filled the temple. All right? So what do you think the meaning of that was? Right? What do you think the meaning of God appearing in a large cloud was? What did that sound like? Where did that happen before? God appearing in a cloud.
When he entered the tabernacle for the first time.
There you go. All right. So reference that in that under that second little paragraph there. That's how God appeared, right, in the tabernacle in the wilderness. Right? That's how God appeared in the tabernacle in the wilderness. Jot that down underneath there. All right? And obviously, where have you seen this in the Bible before? Moses, right? The children of Israel wandering through the desert with the tabernacle and making that the presence of God known there, right? Now, if you guys look at that temple down at the bottom, so the temple was standing, and then later on got wiped out, and then Herod, like I said, rebuilds it. And the cool thing about, I don't want to say the cool thing, the impressive thing about King Herod is that he reconstructed a temple even bigger than this one, right, that Solomon had built, and built it in 18 months, right, where it took a couple hundred years for Solomon and people to build it. Herod did it in much less time, and it did pacify the Jews. They were very happy to have their temple back to worship God and so forth. So it was kind of like, you capture somebody, you tie them up in your basement, but you make sure they have cable television. Right? That's kind of what the Romans did. They captured the Jews. You're under our control, but we're going to build you a temple so you can still worship your God. And they were like, oh, I'm glad to be able to do that, I guess. Right? But they were still captives. Right? They were still captive. All right. So we see some differences in these last couple of minutes between David and Solomon. Both David and Solomon made lots of mistakes as kings, right? And just to give you guys a reference point to something that connects the dots for us, one of you was reading, and I forget where it was. It might have been Anna Jo reading that opening box in the very first page, where it talks about that God had sent judges to lead and direct the people. Their mistake was, in the time of the judges, is that as they entered into the promised land, right, they didn't get rid of who? When they entered into the promised land, who did they not get rid of later?
All the Canaanites.
All the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Ammonites, and all of these ites, and so forth. And some of them got married to them, some of them had them as servants. We've talked about this before. So, jump ahead 500 years, and you got Solomon, great King Solomon, rules there in the Holy Land, and who does he marry? A whole bunch of women, Ammonites, Girgashites, Hittites, Perizzites, Philistines, all these people. And this is why, guys, this is why God said, you kick them all out. or you destroy them, whatever. You've got to get rid of those negative influences, okay? I want you to imagine for a second, you guys don't need to worry about this. Oh, let me put it this way. Let's say, for instance, one of you develops diabetes, all right? You can get it as children. It's pretty rare. You guys know it's a blood disorder, and you can't monitor your blood sugar and things like that, right? It deals with, certain needs. So you go to the doctor, and the doctor says, so here's what we need to do. We need to get rid of all sweets, right, out of your pantry, your house cabinets, and so forth, because it'll cause your sugar to skyrocket and then belly out. That's not good for you, and so I'm oversimplifying this, okay? And so you go, okay, doc, this is important. This is good for my health. I get really sick, maybe even die, and I'm exaggerating. And so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get rid of a lot of the sweets, but not all of them, okay? There's still going to be some in certain cabinets, some in the pantry, and so forth. Is that a good idea? No. The good idea would be to get rid of all of it, like the doctor said. He's smart. He knows what's best for you. God says, here's what's good. I'm smart. I know what's best for you. Get rid of all the other individuals in Canaan, right? And then let it just be my people, my direction, my guidance, my priest speaking to you from me, and so forth. And they go, we'll get rid of some of them. Or maybe even a lot of them, but we're going to keep some of them around. So when Solomon gets married, right? And obviously, in a marriage, that is the closest relationship you're ever going to have in this life, is your spouse. It is going to be the closest, right? It's different than a parent and a child, because as a child, your parent is who they are. You don't get to pick them, right? And in all fairness, your parents don't really get to pick their child, okay? So, you're kind of born into that relationship. But a spouse, right, when you choose one day, guys, to get married, God willing you do, you're going to choose your spouse. So you're inviting that person into a position of great influence in your life. Great influence. In fact, most sociologists would tell you, as people, you cannot have more than 5 friends. Now, that doesn't mean all your friends. That means 5 very close, intimate friends. You can't have more than that. The reason you can't maintain more than that. Now, I'm on Facebook. I don't really care much for it, but I'm on Facebook, right, following things and so forth. And I don't know how many friends I have, but it's more than 5. Okay? I am not close friends with all those people. Some of them don't even pop up on my feed and let me know what's going on, because we're not technically close friends. But the sociologists would say we have no more than 5. Solomon had 700 wives. I don't think he was that close with all 700. You got to believe out of those 700, he had a few favorites. I got to believe that's true. Unless he was really good at, think about it. There's 365 days in a year. That's 2 wives a day if you spent time with them. For half a day. For an entire year. Right? So you sit down with this one wife and kind of go, your name again was, oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, we talked last year. How's that problem you were telling me about? Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. I haven't talked to you in a year. We're going to meet and talk for about 6-7 hours, and then I won't talk to you again for another year. That's how hard it would be. But their influence was there. And since they were pagans, which means they worshiped somebody other than God, and in fact, I can read through this, I won't do it today. Some of them worship Ashtaroth. You guys remember that name? That was the wife of Baal. Right? And so it kind of all connects and kind of comes back around. Okay. Guys, that's all for today. So for those of you at home, fill out your worksheets. Take a picture of those. Get those to me. Guys, we will hook up next time, February 1st, next Monday night, and we'll be halfway through the class. All right? God bless you guys. Have a great rest of the week.